I'm Raju, this is Nandita with me, and we'll be interviewing Professor Uma Dasgupta based on a recent book called History of Santiniketan, Rabindranath Tagore and his life's work, 1861 to 1941. So I have a copy of the book here with me. And, you know, we are very personally also inspired by Rabindranath Tagore, um, Shantiniketan, and last year we celebrated the centenary of his visit to China in several different events that were held in the year, many of which, most of which Professor Dasgupta also participated in. And so we were very excited to see this book and to talk to her more about it. So, Professor Dasgupta, I just want to begin by asking you, I know you've had a very long association with Shantiniketan. Maybe you could just talk about that a little bit. You know, when I was trying to find studies of Shantiniketan and Vishwabharati, books written about it, I was not able to find so many. You would think, given the enormity and the importance of the project, there would be a lot of work done on it. But I wasn't able to find so much. So my sense was that it has not been given enough attention. And so I also wanted to ask you if you agree with that, and why you think
Yes, I do, very much so. I mean, Tagore was obviously a great writer, a great poet, and that goes without saying. But he was also a very committed educator, and that is still almost hardly known. And there have been, so far as I, of course, from my research saw, uh, so this is probably quite factual, no histories of Shantiniketan. No, there have been contemporary tracts.
it?
When I was looking at the archives, when I sort of almost chanced upon this subject, I would say, at a personal level, but also at an academic level. I found that I was asking the archivists and the librarians at Shantiniketan in the Rabindra Bhavan repository, which is the major repository of Tagore's works. And indeed, he lived most of his life in Shantiniketan. So that was very much his life. But indeed, not really. And they said, there are teachers' pamphlets, teachers who taught at the time. They
Mhm.
wrote little pamphlets about their own experience. And that we do call contemporary tracks in historical research. So I could use them, but they were just a very few, not even a handful. But no connected history of either Shantiniketan or or Sriniketan or Vishwabharati.
Mhm.
Obviously all connected. There was also not a history of the ashram where it all started. And indeed, it was called the Shantiniketan ashram by Tagore's father. And this is why I went back to the 1860s because the ashram was founded. It was not an ashram for monks. It was a sort of retreat for um, householders to come and pray, spend time in meditation, which they couldn't do in their households. And indeed, Maharshi needed it for himself. And he had these retreats in the Himalayas for a long, long time. He used to go to the northern Himalayas via Amritsar. He was very fond of the Golden Temple and knew Gurmukhi and knew the songs, and he would always stop there. And he also took his younger son, Rabindranath, when Rabindranath was only 12. That was his first exposure, uh, first outing from Shantiniketan. From Calcutta, from
Mhm.
Jurashakku House, their ancestral house,
Right.
where Tagore was born. So it was really a retreat for himself, for Maharshi. But Maharshi was a householder who ran a household of 100 people at any one given time. So
Mhm.
he was a good householder, but he was also very ascetic in his ways. And so he wanted to get away.
Mhm.
And he did that by going away to the Himalayas for many years. But I think he was getting old and he was finding that too much. So he came closer to home, which was Calcutta, of course. And he knew Pushkara. I don't. You've been there now, and you must have found a railway stop at Pushkara.
Mhm.
Um, for some reason, Maharshi knew Pushkara, and there was this railway line which was a great help. So he took the railway from Kolkata, the East Indian Railway at that time in the late 19th century, from Kolkata to Bolpur, which is still the railway station for Shantiniketan.
Mhm.
And he then was taken in a palanquin across the what we call rural southern Bengal, the Rar area, Birbhum and around, where indeed he also had a very good friend in another zamindar like him. He didn't behave like a zamindar, well, not mostly not, but he certainly had a very good friend in the Sinha family of Raipur, the zamindari family, very major zamindari family. And he asked for a plot of land, which he actually was taken through, which was very quiet, and you could see the horizon from all sides. These are all actually described in Maharshi's writings. And he asked the palanquin bearer to stop. They did, and he stopped and he prayed. And I mean, of course, I can't describe it as a historical fact, but certainly he came uh, to he reached a prayer which he spelled out, and that's written on the gates of the Shantiniketan um, Mandir, which was the original ashram zone, which is now a UNESCO heritage site. And that's where he started an ashram, which of course was a garden house to begin with, just for guests to come.
Mhm.
And soon after, this was in the 1860s. I won't go into the exact dates unless you want the exact dates, then I will. And in 20 years' time, he actually established a trust, which he called the Shantiniketan Trust. And he provided in that trust for a school, a library, and a fair, a village fair, annual village fair, so that the surrounding villages could bring their, and where would they find a market? They would have to go a distance, some distance. So that was the Shantiniketan Trust, which actually Tagore used to great advantage by not just because he had a place there, which he always acknowledged. I had my father's place to go to, but also because Maharshi provided for a school,
Mhm.
which the Shantiniketan school was. And how did I come to this research? How did I come to even? Uh, Shantiniketan certainly had a strong family connection for me because my mother's mother lived her widowed years in Shantiniketan. She was a lady from Dhaka. When her husband died, who was a lawyer in Dhaka, she had four children still who were growing up because family of 16 children. The four were still like in the age of 10 to 15, 16. And Tagore and goes through this very quickly, but it's important, I think. Tagore used to go to Dhaka, of course. And as was the tradition in those times, he was obviously by then quite a celebrity by the time he was going and to Dhaka. And the ladies would get together and cook a wonderful meal for him for each day of his stay. And one of them was my grandmother, was my father's mother.
Mhm.
And so there was a good connection. Um, there was also, it's extremely important, there was also another connection, which was um, my grandfather's youngest sister was a child widow, like so many were at that time. And the two child widows two remarriages of child widows that Tagore, Rabindranath, actually was present for was one, his own son. I won't go into that, but also a teacher of the Shantiniketan school who was married to this Bhishma, my mother's father's sister. So who grew up in their household. They were like one family. And so Rabindranath wrote to my grandmother saying, "Why are you raising these little children in Dhaka all on your own? Just come to Shantiniketan.
Mhm.
We'll have a house ready for you." That was the kind of place Shantiniketan was. So it's important for you as
Mhm.
well. that was really what the place was about. Very much. I mean, at one level, of course, not like a little family. So we'll find a house for you. That history is written in a letter that is a family was a family treasure at one time, but now given to the archives through me, where he said, "Come, we'll have a house for you, and this is very important, and you will have a companion in Labunno, which is the name of this aunt." So he
Mm.
thought of a young widow, but maybe not so young, but of course, a widow with small children. So,
Mhm.
young widow in that sense, although she was probably in her 50s by then. Um, and she certainly had a long uh, household, long years of some years of long household, and so she came, and she raised her 4 children there, and then she lived on there. The children, of course, like everywhere, every family spread to other places. So so I had a strong connection with Shantiniketan, and I used to be taken by my parents
Mm.
to obviously to see my grandmother when I was probably in my uh, in my first decade of growing up. And let me just add this, that my father was actually called to the Sriniketan work, and that was in the
Mm.
1930s. So that was my second connection with Shantiniketan. I was not born before Tagore's passing, so I was born after him. But there were all these stories from earlier that I was obviously very fortunate to have. And my father was called to Sriniketan, and this is the last thing I would say about this, because Tagore was looking out for, as you would know already, because I know you've studied these books, looking out for mo- agricultural scientists who
Mhm.
had learned modern agriculture. And my father was in the UK, where he did
Mm.
his agricultural science. And somehow he would try and find out, or his son, Rabindranath, by which time, I mean, Rabindranath, by that time, Rabindranath was taking a very close part in the Sriniketan work because Tagore was getting quite old.
Mhm.
Um, and so this is how my father was called to take up the first Dartington Fellowship in Sriniketan, 1936 to 1937. And then, of course, they moved back to Kolkata. Um, and so I had this strong family connection. How did I come to this work? Because in 1973, when my husband was teaching at Residency College and I was teaching at Yadavpur University, uh, our son was born. And we were then in Oxford, 2 fellowships, each of us. And our son was born in Oxford. And my husband's teacher, who was then the vice chancellor of Vishwabharati, an eminent historian, called Pratul Chandragupta, wrote to my husband saying, "Why don't you come to Shantiniketan and help us improve the history department?" Which earlier vice chancellors always did
Mm.
because they knew what Shantiniketan was about. And so my husband said to me, "If you agree, we can give up our Calcutta jobs and take our little boy, raise him there, and serve Shantiniketan to
Mm.
Gauss." And that sort of will answer something of a question that we all should have, which is how were we so indifferent to Vishwabharati, to Shantiniketan? Um, because I began by saying, in response to your first question, that he was hardly known as an educator.
Right.
Everyone knew there was this Shantiniketan. Everyone thought it must be a great institution, but
Mm.
Bengalis didn't come forward to help him.
Mm.
Bengali intellectuals, Bengali academics
Mm.
somehow treated it as a rural institution,
Mm.
which it was, but which it was meant to be as well.
Mm.
Not for the sake of it being rural, but he wanted a close connection with Shantiniketan, between Shantiniketan and the city. In other words, the village and the city, because Shantiniketan was surrounded by hundreds of old villages. tribals, Muslims, and Hindus, much older than Shantiniketan was.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came, I was when we came to Shantiniketan, I was obviously looking. I would have looked for a postdoctoral research project because once you start research, you don't want to stop it. And and nor did my husband want that I stop my research. That's why he said, "Look, try and find something close by to Shantiniketan work on. Then we can all be together as a family without you having to go anywhere because the child is so small."
Mm-hmm.
And I completely agreed with him. And so we came, and I began to look at the Rabindra Bhawan archives, which we always knew to be literary archives, which it is, but that it had so many letters, thousands of letters from all
Mm-hmm.
over the world, from India to Tagore, and he also answered letters. And that I think we never factored in.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I found nothing written on Shantiniketan as a history,
Mm-hmm.
and the archivist also didn't know that there was anything, quite rightly, except for those tracks. I said, what about the letters? They said, yes, the letters are there. They're still being hand listed.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a catalog. And I said, okay, never mind. Can you still let me read those letters? And I'll be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
And and I did. And I didn't know who had come, who had gone, how Shantiniketan had come up. So I just started from A because it was alphabetical for them. I mean, their hand listing was alphabetical, and although it was incomplete, I started from A and went through the files. And there was so much that he wrote on Shantiniketan. There was so much that he wrote about what he wanted of Shantiniketan as the years passed, and what were his disappointments, what were his hopes. So that's how I actually wrote a history of Shantiniketan and a history of Sriniketan. That was my research, which went on for years,
Mm-hmm.
because Tagore uh, needs time to really understand.
Mm-hmm.
There were two reasons for it, because it was a very different world that he was creating.
Mm-hmm.
And it not like a middle class uh, Indian, even if you call it intellectual, even if you call it
Yeah.
cultural,
Yeah.
not at all.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really building a way of life
Mm-hmm.
in Shantiniketan, away from the city and yet close to the city. In fact, this was his great trump card almost. He said, I want the city and the village close. And the city, after all, has things that the village doesn't have, such as libraries, laboratories, etc. And we will have access to those because Calcutta was not far.
Mm-hmm.
And the village has tradition, and we will bring experiment to the village. And we can only do that if we decide to cooperate with one another, the city and the village. So that was absolutely fundamental to this whole idea. And he even went to the extent of saying that I don't mean that all I want is, a rural thing, a rural education, a rural institution, because in his own words, rustic is a word that also denotes something that is not sustainable.
Mm.
So these are some key
Right.
things that I mentioned.
Right. Right. No, thank you very much. Onaida, did you want to say something? Um, and I think well, also thank you for, giving some of the history of how Shantiniketan was established. And yeah, I find it very, I mean, I find it very, um, well, should we say, I mean, it is surprising that's what constitutes one of um, really a very important project
Mhm.
in Indian history, particularly during the time of our freedom struggle, um, has uh, received so little attention. And I just personally would like to say that I think you've done, you've done really a service. Uh, but that, I mean, just personally, I want to express my gratitude to you. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit about the philosophy, I guess Tagore's philosophy as an educator, and you use this term, the Shantiniketan quest in the book, and you connect it to Rabindranath's philosophy. And what I found particularly striking was that you connected it to his approach to Indian history. And so I have this quote from your book where you say that Rabindranath concluded that his country's history thus grew out of a social civilization where a continuous attempt was made to evolve adjustment of peoples and races. And so I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, what the Shantiniketan quest was and how it was connected to his philosophy.
Thank you. Yes, I think I can do that. I'll try. Um, Indeed, I mean, Tagore wrote essays on India's history, and Rabindranath Sharkar was a grounded historian. Tagore wasn't. In
Hmm.
fact, translated into English because Tagore wrote all of those 5, 6 essays on India's history in Bangla. So
Hmm.
he translated one of them um, uh, in those times, thinking this is very important history. And yet, as you know, Tagore was not reading in the archives. Now, he did actually believe that we were not in that sense a nation because we were not a state. That's
Hmm.
one thing. Um, and therefore, that sense of nation hadn't come because, after all, we were colonized earlier, and close to Tagore's life and in Tagore's life for a second time. We don't always talk of the Mughal period as a as a as a colony, but it definitely was because there was a lot of merging of cultures,
Hmm.
right? But the British was a different issue because, after all, they were in all senses foreign. Whereas, of course, some senses the Mughals were also foreign, but that's not how we treated it because what Tagore believed and what is, I think, historically proven that India not being for ages a nation state as it is now um, was a civilization, a social civilization where many other civilizations, many other streams of cultures were coming in.
Hmm.
And this is why there has been a race problem,
Hmm.
which Tagore never denied. He said there is a race problem, and there has been a race problem, is a race problem. To the end of his life, he said it hadn't been resolved. But what had happened, he completely believed in that, and he documented it in his own way in his essays, was that there was continuous attempt to bring the Hindu Muslims, the Hindus and the Muslims, uh, who were the major players in the
But
stream.
sorry to interrupt, but just as
Mm,
a clarification,
mm.
when he was using race, he really meant it as something similar to civilization. Is that correct? Or
Partly, but
okay.
there was conflict too
Hmm.
in that sense, race too.
Hmm. But not in the
What?
biological sense that,
Oh,
yeah.
oh no, yes, I guess so.
Hmm.
Yes, I guess so. Not
Yeah.
that that was specifically dealt with.
Hmm.
But the conflict part was obviously getting a bit sometimes out of hand
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
various reasons, for
Hmm.
religious reasons.
Right.
However, what gave him so much hope that although it hasn't been resolved, but there is a continuous attempt
Hmm.
because of two things. One was that where was the problem? The problem was they lived next to one another, Hindus and Muslims. I mean, Shantiniketan, he did, in his own words, say was an ideal site for an alternative education because there were Hindus, Muslims, and tribals living in the same area.
Hmm.
So ethnically, absolutely authentic to his cause. Okay, if we call it his cause. So they were staying next to one another, but they wouldn't marry, they wouldn't eat with one another. That was the basic thing over, if you call it race.
Hmm.
They wouldn't, this thing of touch,
Hmm.
which, as you know, is very endemic to Orthodox Hinduism, also Orthodox Islam. All right. So, therefore, how was it being resolved? At least, there was staying next to one another, physically there, although there were these differences. Secondly, he believed very much, he was devoted actually to the medieval saints,
Mm.
whom he called the people's saints. Nanak was one of them, his great hero.
Mm.
He wrote on the Sikh Gurus. Nanak was a great hero. And then there was Chaitanya, who brought this great movement of love and mingling with one another,
Mhm.
right? And actually almost teaching the people that there is no other creature greater than man. So, that whole thing of humanism, it is all related to this. So, man is the most, there is no other greater than man. So, don't fight as man and man come together. And
Mhm.
Chaitanya's movement became a Bhakta movement,
Mhm.
Bhakta movement,
Mhm.
as was Guru Nanak's. They were
Mhm.
completely, there was no question of secularism, non secularism in
Mhm.
them.
Mhm.
So this is why he thought there was this continuous attempt, because these medieval saints, Dadu, Kabir,
Mhm.
right? There's no question of anti-Hindu, anti-Muslim. And yet there was this conflict. There's no doubt about that. I mean, later historians, as you know, treat it as the British way of dividing people.
Mhm.
How could they have divided people if there hadn't been a problem? And
Mhm.
that is the thing that Tagore never went for.
Mhm.
He never said it was the fault of the British. He always said, we have to look within. We have
Mhm.
to see what our problem is. So basically that. So this is why that comment by him that there is a continuous attempt to resolve the conflict, because conflict couldn't be denied. Even his novel Gora. What was Gora? Gora was an, an orphan born of Irish parents.
Mhm.
And how he was abandoned, nobody knows. I mean, maybe his parents died, but he was abandoned and he was picked up by loving Orthodox Hindu parents who Gora, that's how Gora, why was he called Gora? Because he was a white man, and that's the
Mhm.
Bengali word for white man, for a
Mhm.
white man specifically. Um, colloquially they used to say Gora Gora,
Mhm.
the white people.
Mhm.
So Gora. Because his parents were not trying to hide anything, but they were bringing him up as their own child.
Mhm.
And Gora grew up as an Orthodox Hindu, so Orthodox more than his adopted parents, his surrogate parents.
Mhm.
Till one day, as he matured, he realized that, oh dear, he would not ever be able to include the Muslims in his world
Mhm.
because the orthodoxy, Hindu orthodoxy would never allow Muslims into their fold.
Mhm.
So that's Tagore telling the story
Mhm.
in a novel. And therefore he, sort of came out with this. It's beautiful. It is translated. If you haven't read it as yet, you can.
Mhm.
That I now realize that nothing is more important than India, which is my country. We are one country, we are one people. Our food is one, our religion is one. So we are India, we are Indians. That's Tagore's sort of way of resolving the conflict.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it was not a temporary thing, or it was not a, sort of a period thing. It historically is a period thing, but he was trying to resolve it also in his own way, because Tagore was very fond of not actually lecturing at people, but telling stories through plays, drama, novels.
Mhm.
Kaurivadi is another where he told the story of Swadeshi, which
Mhm.
he didn't at all not in the way that Swadeshi turned out to be. He leapt into the Swadeshi movement. He was totally unpolitical, non-political, apolitical, even as a young man. But when the Swadeshi movement started in Bengal, he thought, oh, you know, he must, and he did. And he was responsible for leading this procession of Hindus and Muslims and putting rakhis on them, the Rakhi
Mhm.
Bandhan in the wristband. which is Rakhi stands for friendship, a symbol of friendship.
Hmm.
So he did that. He walked the procession. He led the procession. But he left it. He left the Swadeshi movement in one day when he realized that there had been riots from within
Hmm.
the Congress of those days.
So,
This is 1905,
right.
the Congress,
Hmm.
as old as 18. So he left, in one day, he left the Swadeshi movement. He announced that he would never join a political movement ever again in his life because he couldn't believe that Muslims were being killed by Hindus in the name of Swadeshi.
Mm.
So that was that other connect and disconnect, however you want to put it.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Umadi, that what you were saying earlier, I guess to the last question that Raju had asked, that we also, the reason why we're so interested in this question of why Shantiniketan has not been studied is because for us it has really been a process of discovery through struggle, because we've really had to look for this example. And I feel almost that our generation has not been taught what we have inherited. So it's in that context that I feel, there has been a lapse in our intellectual culture almost. I mean, just the richness of what you're describing, that none of it has really received the attention that it deserves. And I guess to what you were saying just now, the way I hear what you're saying is that for Rabindranath, the quest of, all of what he did was really a quest for unity and synthesis in some ways. And not only, I guess, what you're describing between the races within India, Hindus and the Muslims, but also within Asia. And for Raju and I, we really came to Shantiniketan almost through Cheena Bhavan. And you say in the book that, there's a quote in your book from the preamble of the Shantiniketan Constitution, which says that one of the aims of Shantiniketan is to approach the West from the standpoint of the unity of the life and thought of Asia. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit to Cheena Bhavan and, of course, to Tanyun Shan and I guess this quest for unity. And I mean, even the fact that he saw that there was unity of life and thought in Asia in a time when we were so fragmented by colonialism and so, drowned under the weight of illiteracy and poverty. So, yeah, I was hoping you could say something about that.
But you're very right. In fact, what you said that towards the end, that we were so fragmented by colonialism. And this is why, even with being obviously a part of Asia, that that factor was hardly ever even, uh, part of the civilizational dialogue or intercivilization dialogue or any dialogue. Now, however, there are two things here that also need to be combined, which is that there was a pan-Asian movement which was being led by a man like Okakura Tenshin. And he was coming to Calcutta. Calcutta then was, of course, the hub. Calcutta was the capital of British India, and indeed, a lot of things were happening in Calcutta. It's not quite, I mean, it was in today's sort of slightly awful language, happening place. Not like now, where I believe other cities like Delhi are more happening. But Okakura, for example, actually came to meet the Tagores because he wanted them to be part of the Pan-Asian movement. Now, he didn't succeed very well because Tagore was not quite a movement person. But do you know who Okakura actually did have as a very close partner in this? Swami Vivekananda.
Right.
Okakura used to come and live in Belur Math.
Hmm.
Mm. But however, it was there, the Pan-Asian. Though Tagore didn't sort of take part in the Pan-Asian movement, but he believed in the intercivilizational dialogue, which is so, which is what struck me about the name of your NGO, because it's so fundamental to Tagore's world. So this is why he wanted to travel all over Asia, and he did. China was the first. Well, actually, Japan was the first. But Japan was so in between by then, because it had made such a lot of technological progress. And it had even been attacked by China, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, sorry, it had even attacked China. I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. Seriously. So therefore, Japan maybe itself was torn between the West and the East. But Japan's art was very important to Tagore, but I won't go into that now, because then that will really be a diversion. But certainly he came to China, as you know very well. You celebrated it as one of the first groups to celebrate the 100th year of his visit to China. And he took his key people from Vishwabharati. By then, Vishwabharati was, of course, a growing institution, Vishwabharati International University. He took Nandalal Bose, he took Elmhurst, he took Hitimon Sen, because he wanted the China experience to also come to Vishwabharati. So indeed, the Asian thing was coming into. The other part, which was important to Tagore, I don't doubt that for a moment. But he was not somebody who was constantly dwelling on the colonial, but he was surrounded by the colonial. After all, he was born in colonial times. He was growing up in colonial times. But why wasn't he so keen to be anti-colonial? He rejected imperialism. He rejected colonialism. People didn't understand it because they thought, oh, he was anti-nationalist. The nationalists said that about him. Indian Bengali nationalists said that about him. Never, though, Gandhi or Nehru. Never. They understood what he was about. But the core, some of the core nationalist people, nor did Subhash Chandra Bose, I must say, but that's Gandhi and Nehru to begin with. So this was because his intention was this other thing, that the world must be one. So governments are one thing. This was very critical to what he wrote. And governments are one thing, the people are another. So let us not mix the two.
Right.
Let us not reject the people because the government has colonized, but that doesn't mean every British has colonized India. This was and he even wrote a very, very sort of striking essay. Of course, in Bangla, it was never translated in his time by him. There are now translations called Boro or Choto. Boro is big and Choto is small. So very general, Boro. And one of the big key themes in this essay was that Boro is the person who is thinking Boro. Choto is the person who is thinking Choto small. So Choto is the government because they're thinking small. They treat us as a strange race. They can't mingle with us. As Gandhi said right at the end, we will not ask the British to quit unless they absolutely prove, we are prepared to wait, absolutely prove that they do not want to belong to the brotherhood of mankind, rather brotherhood of men. Then only we will ask them to quit. Otherwise not. So see, very profound thoughts, very similar to the two, although they were probably not talking about this. So it was that thing that, we won't, let the government do what they do, but the people are there. And the people matter more. And therefore, he was quite, what shall I say? It was I think, continuing effort to break out of being a colonial provincial, which every Indian then was. And the Tagore family were a very prominent family, an outstanding family. His grandfather was the first Indian not to be called a banya by the British, but to be called a merchant. These are all sort of historical things.
Hmm.
Why? Because Dwarkanath, Prince, as the people called him Prince because he was so charitable and he had so much wealth. So it was a people's name that he had. He was not a prince, in the sense that we understand the word. Um, he actually became a shareholder, a partner of a joint venture company, trading in indigo, trading in many other things, with the British. And this is why they called him a merchant, because the Hindu Banyas were Banyas. They never traded with the British. This company was called the CAR, CARR, that's the British partner, Tagore and Company. So there was that other cosmopolitanism in the family, even though his father was very grounded in sort of Hindu scriptures, Hindu texts, not in Hindu orthodoxy,
Hmm.
because they were anyway a breakaway movement. But he always said that no matter that we are a breakaway, a Protestant movement in the proper term, proper use of the word, because we do believe that Hinduism is not about worshipping icons. That is what we object to. That is custom. That is
Hmm.
not scriptures. Therefore, we are Hindus, even though we are a breakaway. But don't say that we are not Hindus. That was his kind of politicism that he fought for, Morshi, Tagore's father. So there was a lot of cosmopolitanism, a lot of very strong Indian cultural, civilizational, intercivilizational faith in them. And this is why, when all the icons were moved from the Jurashaku Tagore house, Tagore wrote that he was born at a time when they were outcasts because they were anyway treated by by the Hindu orthodoxy. That's a different story, but it is true. They were thrown out of the Hindu orthodox caste system as high Brahmins. They were named, categorized, labeled as Pir Ali Brahmins. Pir, Muslim word for avatar, God, Ali, Pir Ali Brahmins, because one of the ancestors, and that is, I come back to that thing of touch and food. One of the ancestors had apparently, although this is legendary, but there must have been some truth in this. I mean, legends are not based on absolute nothing. They smelt uh, beef or pork or something. I forget now. They smelled something that was anti, that was not. I mean, Hindus, as you know, don't take beef, so it was raw beef. They, one of his ancestors. No, pork must have been pork. I beg your pardon. So, I mean, I'm so kind of out of all this in the sense,
Hmm.
but it's important to know. I mean, it's important to discuss, and I do know it. I've read it all. So pork, because the Muslims,
Right.
they thought he was partly Muslims. They were parts of it. The Tagore Brahmins were partly, because they were proper high Brahmins, because they were Thakurs. You couldn't be Thakur without this. This is how their surname is with anglicized by the British. But they were Thakur, Rabindranath Thakur. We don't usually refer to him as Rabindranath Tagore, but we say Rabindranath is Rabindranath Thakur, is the Bengali word. Because they were originally priests.
Right.
Okay, so but however, there was this breakaway movement, the Brahmo movement, etc., and therefore you have one we you I everyone has to understand their cosmopolitanism as something not just as we understand cosmopolitanism to be, but very rooted in their own
Yes.
culture.
Yes. Yeah, I like what you said that he rejected being a colonial entity in that time. And it's almost like in rejecting that place that was kind of given to him, he decided to ascend the stage of history. And I think he's in many ways, him and Shantiniketan both are very futuristic. And I almost feel that, in my view, they're more, in some ways, they are more accessible to be taken up in this time than maybe even they were in his time. Because we have such a new
Mm.
movement. I guess our people are, in a new place. And we are seeking out new ways of being modern, and as you said, cosmopolitan, but also modern. um, but I wanted to say that I'm very moved by what you're saying, the emphasis on the human. And I mean, you see it all over Shantiniketan. You see it not only in his own writings, but for example, in Kala Bhavan and all of these great artists that come out of Kala Bhavan, because really um, and when I say emphasis on the human, I'm pointing to your comment that he didn't think about intercivilizational dialogue as something between governments, but really between men, people knowing each other, and basically the idea that man must know man, and woman must know woman. But
Mm.
um,
Mm.
yeah,
Man in
and
the very general, mankind, I mean, which is
yes.
also woman.
Yes, and I mean, I really see that kind of flowering in the experiment of Kala Bhavan. And I mean, to me, it seems like the artwork and the Shantiniketan School of Art is something that is of, historic importance for all of mankind. Um, and it's really, I see it as an achievement of human beings. But really, again, understudied, I feel. So I was hoping you could say something about this, what made it possible? I mean, all of this outburst of creativity, um, and new forms, I don't know how better to say it, but new forms, creative forms.
Mm. Yes, because this entire experiment for a different education, a new education, which is what Shantiniketan is about. I remember I started from by saying, bring the city and the village close.
Yes.
Was not obviously it was nothing to do with colonial education, which was the only other thing there was. I mean, there were tolls and chatushpatis from the past, but they were really dying entities. They were hardly there. They were there, but they were but it was basically colonial education, right? And then there is Tagore, in a sense, rejecting colonial education, but not harping on that.
Yes.
He had nothing against English. In fact, he himself taught English at the Shantiniketan Vidyalaya. He wrote primers in English, but their medium of study had to be Bangla, because otherwise he believed, and he wrote and he said, you couldn't be creative unless you do it in your own language. So Bangla, yes, but you have to also know English because it's a very useful language. Without English, you can't reach out to the world. And that is what he himself was doing. How was he trying to break out of being a colonial provincial? It was not rhetoric. He certainly had studied English, but he taught himself more English. He started writing in English because he wanted to reach out to the world. And he knew
Right.
there was no other way he could reach out to the world. So alternative education in various ways. However, what were we wanting at that time? Even Nehru has written about this. Leave alone to go. We were wanting English education because we knew that the only way to get jobs from the government was, and indeed, colonial education was aiming at that. They were creating clerks, doctors,
Mhm.
and the middle class Indians were lending themselves to this. So this whole thing of being indifferent to Tagore's institutions, which you asked at the beginning, why didn't we serve more? Why didn't Bengali intellectuals serve Shantiniketan? As of course some of them did, but a very
Yes.
few. He had more Western um support as human support. I don't mean money. He was artists came from. They loved the Shantiniketan, and he used to announce this. Anyone who likes my idea, come to Shantiniketan. Kiti Monsen said to him, one of the core people there, said Amartya Sen's grandfather, incidentally, but a family that was sort of transformed themselves to the Shantiniketan soil. Kirti wasn't born in Shantiniketan, but Amartya Sen was. He said to Tagore, you are inviting all these people, how will we look after them? What is their intention? And he said, look, I can only play the flute at the gate and invite people. You will have to do the looking after. Don't worry. You have to only give them your love. They will be happy. These are all on record. These are part of the letters that I studied. These are all on record. So therefore, yes. One other element in this whole experiment was that he may not, of course, he did not join the Pan-Asian movement of Okakura, but Okakura was one of his closest friends, although Okakura died young, so his friendship, but even his wife remembered what a close friend, how close they were as friends. So when Tagore went to Japan, Okakura's wife made sure that he was brought to their home without Okakura, but brought to their home. And there are some beautiful sort of mentions of these things in the letters, which even he wrote in his letters of Japan Jatri, the traveler to Japan. All in Bangla, but some of it has been translated into English. So Asian, yes. If anything could be put up as a sort of, not as a barrier, but as a, let's say, as a contrast between Western colonialism and our larger identity, not just as was our Asian identity. So Asian unity meant a lot to him. And indeed, Vishwabharati's early name, the early name that he thought of for a larger university was an Eastern university. He called it an Eastern university. In fact, there is a whole long essay that he wrote, which is called An Eastern University. And then there's this very, very, moving and, of course, important correspondence, historically speaking, with C.F. Andrews, saying, Charlie, you thought I belong only to Asia, but I've been now to the world. Nobel Prize, he had won the Nobel Prize. He had become a citizen of the world. One can't deny that. And he was being called from everywhere. Like Nobel, we know how Nobel laureates are treated even today, even if you don't know their work. You want to buy, the first thing you want to buy if a Nobel Prize winner's book has been published and marketed. Okay, so he therefore said to C.F. Andrews, look, I can't just call it an Eastern university. It must be an international university. So that's how Vishwabharati got its name. Look, Charlie, please understand, I belong to the world. The world has accepted me. His words, the world has accepted. So all these things were coming together. It was larger to larger, I think, concept. The concept was growing because it had all the roots. Even in 1902, which was within 1 year of the Shantiniketan Vidyalaya, Okakura sent a Japanese man to Shantiniketan, a Sanskritist, Hori-san. Jagadish Chandra Bose was a very close friend of Tagore's from their younger years, really young years. And Jagadish Chandra Bose was his first companion, mainly through correspondence, but not only through correspondence, with whom he was sharing the Shantiniketan idea. And when Okakura wrote to Tagore, that he wanted to send this Japanese Sanskritist to learn more Sanskrit. And which better place could he go to but Shantiniketan? 1902, Tagore welcomed him. Jagadish Chandra Bose welcomed him. Then they found, and this is part of our Asian, what shall I say, trying to deepen our Asian cultural identity. After all, we're not bothered about political identity. Tagore wasn't, so we are not. But cultural identity, yeah. So that he would go to these libraries, copy these manuscripts, and then bring them to India so that India has these libraries. Now, as it happened, the plan fell through because Hori-san went to Kashmir and fell to typhus, which was a very dangerous illness at that time, and died. So Hori-san was there in India all of, I think, 5 to 6 years. He's left a diary. So all this is on record. I mean, obviously not of his death, but it's been edited by a Japanese professor of literature called Tazumo. It was written in English. It was written in Japanese, and he's obviously translated it first into Bengali and then into English. So it's all there. So anyway, therefore, the Asian identity was a cultural identity that Tagore wanted to push. And you'd be surprised, this beautiful correspondence, since you're also very interested in the Kala Bhavan movement, which was almost like a parallel movement of its own. You know, Kala Bhavan was actually started before Vishwabharati was institutionalized in 1919, because Kala Bhavan meant so much to Tagore.
Wow.
And for Kala Bhavan, actually, Tagore was writing to Rabindranath, who was a Swadeshi and remained a Swadeshi for a very long time. Tagore left out of it, but not Rabindranath, and would not go anywhere else. And the Bengal School of Art, which Rabindranath founded, of course, a very remarkable school of art and has been recognized to be so, it doesn't need me to say it, was entirely a Swadeshi-based art movement. And Tagore said, please, after all, uncle and nephew, please go to Japan. Look at their art. It's very important for us to know Japan's art. I'll stop here because one can say more. Because all this is on record, so all this has been read. But I just want to complete one thing about the visit, because it's so important to your intellectual, about your question. Why are Bengali intellectuals, which you started almost with, why was Tagore's experiment marginalized? Why wasn't it taken up? Because I think of what I was saying then, that middle class education was very important to the Bengali psyche and to the Indian psyche. I think it was also the Punjabi psyche. If one reads Tandon's book, I think one knows that too. In other words, they wanted to be professionals. And one can't quite blame them for it because new ideas were coming into it. But then one has to understand, therefore, they had not any time for an alternative education, which was Tagore's Shantiniketan, Sriniketan, Vishwabharati experiment. In one phrase, one must say this, that it was an alternative education where no degrees were ever given. And the students came to Tagore in his time and said, look, where will we go? You are not giving us any degrees. He understood. He was not at all an unsympathetic man. This is important for us to understand this. He said, however, I cannot have Vishwabharati give degrees, but I will arrange for you. I understand your need for it. He tied up with University of Calcutta that their syllabus would be taught as a parallel course to the Vishwabharati course in Shantiniketan for those students who wanted, and some students did, and take their exams at the University of Calcutta and their degrees from the University of Calcutta, which Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, who was also a great intellectual and greatly understood Tagore's at his core, said, yes, of course, let that be done. And this is why Vishwabharati also actually had graduates who were Vishwabharati graduates not by degree, but Calcutta University's graduates by degree, because they did two parallel courses. So that, in other words, what I'm trying to say was alternative education absolutely from A to Z, because Tagore did not give degrees. That he stuck to. All of that has changed, Nandini. All of that has changed, Raju. Although I know you said very beautifully that it is a futuristic thing, and I hope, and it must be, philosophically it is, but I don't see any hope for it as something that will completely reverse itself. And I think the first person to have understood this was Tagore. He didn't think his Vishwabharati would survive. And that was why he said to Gandhi, This last letter to Gandhi was this: will you take it as a trust? Will you be its trustee? If you believe this is a national, these were his words, it's in my biography of Tagore, the last words. If you believe it's it's an institution of national importance, if you believe it is an institution of international institution, then I hope my country will believe the same and preserve it. And I leave it to you. And I won't go into Gandhi's answer, but why did he say this? He was anxious that this institution would not survive. So I think you have to connect all this in your mind and my and anyone who's interested in the subject, understanding of the whole experiment, why in a sense failed. You could call it a failure. How many people are following this? It's in University of the central government of the University Grants Commission has to follow their syllabus, has to follow their degree from absolutely from bottom up and up down all the way. So it can't survive as it was conceptualized. So
Yes.
therefore, yes, ideas will have their future always. And there will always be people like you who are interested in those ideas, me who would be interested in the history of those ideas and also the ideas, of course, and believe in them. But that's about all. And there are many such. And I think this is true of all over the world, wherever there are creators. I think it would be true also of a great, of of a genius as a thinker as a genius in Japan and anywhere else.
Yeah, maybe in the future.
No,
And sorry, Raju, just before you say the last question, I think that, I mean, you're right, Umari, that, in one sense it has been a failure, but um, yeah, I hope that in the future it can be taken up. That's the,
Indeed, so do
yeah.
I. I join you in that hope. Yes, of
Go
course.
ahead, Raju, sorry.
no, so I was really thinking, this many of the questions you're discussing with regard to Tagore's philosophy of education are many of these questions are still with us, and particularly recently they've been there in the public discourse, question of English education and
Mm,
um, so on. And
yeah,
I think of how much Tagore's ideas would contribute to this.
yeah.
Um, but
Yes.
but if he was seen as an educator, and
Well, yes. I mean, I
um,
very recently listened to Yogendra Yadav,
Yes.
and he blames this whole thing. I
uh-huh,
mean, I'm sure you know his work. His title was Reclaiming the Republic.
uh-huh,
And he thinks that reclaiming the Republic is hardly
uh-huh,
possible. Well, he thinks he's hopeful. I must say he ended on a hopeful note. Unless we elite, I mean, of course, I suppose he would treat all of us as elite in his own way of thinking.
mhm,
So devoted ourselves to English education and that we couldn't combine the two. That,
mhm,
I think, was his sort of
mhm,
final message. We may agree with him, we may not. That's not the issue. But
mhm.
because you're talking about this, but carry on, Roger. If you think that I related to your
Yeah,
question properly.
yeah, yeah. No, I was just commenting that just it I was just
Yes.
I just thought about it as I was listening to you. And I just also wanted to say earlier that some of these institutions, Cheena Bhavan and Kala Bhavan, and you mention others in your book, Sangeet Bhavan, Vidya Bhavan. I mean, many of them have, I mean, as you're saying, a history in their own right, just as
Mm,
yeah, just
mm,
in terms of
mm,
how much
mm,
happened in these institutions.
mm.
And but just to move on, I did want to end by, um, and maybe I'll try and frame it as one question because in many ways the work of Tagore that's become quite popular, especially in recent time, is his book Nationalism, and the um, or the book Nationalism that has, many of his um,
Yes.
speeches, essays. Yeah. But and many times he is seen as, or he is often sometimes counterposed to Gandhi. Gandhi was the nationalist, Tagore was the cosmopolitan. And in particular, that exchange of letters that they had in the non-cooperation movement um, is, seen as evidence of that. And it's the thing that has, throughout your work, including your work on the relationship of Tagore, Andrews, and Gandhi, but also in this book, you have a chapter on his relationship to Gandhi. It has always struck me that you view the relationship very differently. Tagore and Gandhi's relationship, you see them as much closer together. You emphasize the visit of Gandhi to Shantiniketan in 1940. And even right now, you just mentioned how Tagore entrusted Vishwabharati Shantiniketan to Gandhi at the end. And so I wonder if you could relate his ideas of nationalism um, uh, to his relationship to Gandhi in the context of the freedom struggle. Um, yeah, I
Yes,
don't know if that's a well-formed question, but
no, I'll
yeah.
try. Uh, well, First, let me say that I don't think there was such a huge difference between Gandhi and Tagore in their thoughts about nationalism. The only real difference, which made it such a predominant kind of uh, leaves everyone with such a predominant question in one's mind, uh, is because Gandhi had to then try to get freedom for his country. Now, did Tagore want freedom for his country? Yes, he did. But there was one, I think, difference between Tagore and the Congress Party, but I don't think between Gandhi and Tagore, except at one point, which is Tagore thought and believed. Whether he was right or not, no historians can speculate on that. That yes, freedom is most important, but freedom will come when we are united as a people. The race problem and all this. We are united in our
Mhm.
diversity, and we therefore can stand up on our own. The British or any other colonizer will just leave on their own. And how can we do this? We
Mhm.
can do this by actually concentrating on social justice, which we have not done. Even the nationalist movement,
Mhm.
in fact, that is what his fight with the Congress Party was. To go so he used to be very critical of the Indian National Congress, very critical. He even called them beggars. And this is all on record also. But anyway, therefore, uh, in a sense, Tagore also almost blamed Gandhi that he did not give enough emphasis to social justice. Now, Gandhi's point of view was, of course, I didn't, I shall, but let the country first become free. That is where I think their basic difference was. Tagore didn't was Tagore thought even within the constraints of colonialism, we could still strike out on our own and create a more just society. And that in itself will be a movement that will help our freedom. This was the big difference. Now, whether Gandhi was right, nobody can speculate. In other words, in pushing first for freedom, that's what I mean, right or wrong. Or Tagore was right in pushing back in that sense from freedom, not pushing freedom as the political freedom as freedom, yes, but freedom from being united and freedom from being socially just, not suppressing manhood in the way for ages Indians have done, our people have done. That's one thing, Raju. And the other thing is, you see, Tagore was not for the nation state. It was not that he was anti-nationalism. That is a that is a point he's made in his writings, but I don't think that has been big. That's about all that I should say.
Okay. So I guess we can end this here.
Yes, yes,
Thank you very much, Umadi. And actually, what you're saying at the end reminded me. I don't have it with me right now, but I think Nehru had written when the centenary volume for Tagore had come out in 1961. I think maybe Nehru had written the preface to that,
yes,
where
absolutely.
I will
Yeah.
only paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me. But he had said that initially,
Mm,
it was Gandhi who struck him and the younger people,
yes,
and they were almost a little bit impatient with Tagore. And it was only gradually that Tagore seeped into their consciousness.
yes,
Um,
yes.
and
You,
I,
you
I have
remember
always
correctly.
found
You
that,
remember correctly.
Yeah.
You remember correctly.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
Um,
yes. I think intellectually, Nehru
yeah,
was
that,
so to say.
yeah,
Thank you
yeah,
for
yeah.
Yeah,
sharing your
Amrita,
thoughts.
you're saying
thank you.
something?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, I just was going to say that it's I think in because of your work we have found the I guess ground to substantiate what our own instinct was, Umadi, that the because the thing is nowadays when people talk about the freedom struggle, it's always from the positioning of debate rather than of confluence. And I think if we have to have a vision for the future, one has to take what is best in our thinkers and really find the unity in them. So yeah, I guess that's why he was asking about Gandhi and Tagore, because really to us they seem much closer together than farther apart. And I mean, we found some resonance for that in your work. So, but thank you for taking the time to
Thank you
speak
very
with
much.
us.
Not at all. Thank you.